Hello, everyone. We hope you all had fun virtually camping with us yesterday. Thank you for joining us again today for our second day of our 3-day third-party risk management boot camp. My name is Jessie Redmond, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use. If you're not familiar with our webinars or did not join us yesterday, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide those widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of the widget. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can submit them through the Ask Question widget. We love getting questions and do capture all of them throughout the session, so we'll be answering some during the live webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer, we will address via email. In the Related Content widget, you'll see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, a link to our resources library, which has hundreds of educational resources, and links to several specific resources that we feel will be helpful if you'd like to learn more about certain topics discussed today. Today's live session is eligible for up to 2 CPE credits, 1 per hour. If you wish to receive these credits, please remember to answer all of the polling questions that will appear on your screen during each session's presentations. You will also be sent a follow-up survey link 24 hours after the bootcamp has concluded on Friday, April 21st, that will need to be completed in order to receive the credit. We hope you found day 1 of the bootcamp valuable. We covered inherent risk versus residual vendor risk and the basics of what you need to know, as well as steps and strategies for vendor due diligence. Today we're going to cover vendor contracts, third-party risk management and supply chain, vendor data breaches, and complementary user entity controls within vendor SOC reports. For the next hour, we will be joined by VendMinder's president, Kelly Vick, who will talk about critical vendors, fourth parties, and exit strategies within vendor contracts. After Kelly's session, we will hear from VendMinder's Information Security Operations Director, Lisa Mayhill, who will discuss third-party risk management and supply chain. At 2 p.m. Eastern Time, Lisa May will be back to talk about vendor data breaches and complementary user entity controls within vendor SOC reports. With all that being said, I'd like to hand it over to Kelly. Kelly, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Jessie. And once again, everyone, welcome back to day 2. I'm glad you've all returned for this session about some key vendor contract considerations. For those of you who have attended our boot camps in the past, you will find this session is very different than our previous contract management sessions. So let's take a quick look at the agenda for this half hour. We will cover the basics as we've done in the past, the what, why, and who of vendor contract management. We will spend a good deal of time talking about fourth-party vendors and how to account for them in your contracts. We'll also talk through some specific considerations as it relates to critical vendors. And lastly, we will provide an overview of exit strategies. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's start with a quick review of the third-party risk management lifecycle and point out where contracting lives. It actually lives in all 3 stages. It lives in onboarding because you're obviously going to be writing a contract with the vendor as you bring them on into your company. It should be in your ongoing because as you are reviewing your vendor, you should be reviewing the contract as well. And then it is also a part of the offboarding because you're going to be working through an exit strategy to offboard off of that contract. And we're going to talk about each of those in this webinar today. So as we dive into this, we first need to know what is vendor contract management. And it is simply the oversight of written agreements between you and your chosen vendors. But what's involved in that process is negotiating the terms of that agreement, establishing due diligence and incorporating controls around the relevant risks that you identified in that due diligence process. Generally, your contract management process includes some repeatable process for reviewing, approving, and executing the contract. And then from an ongoing and managing and tracking standpoint, you would have some type of contract management system. The important thing to note here is that contract management is not a one and done process. Because you will do this repeatedly throughout the life of your relationship with the contract, as we mentioned previously in the life cycle. And it can be difficult and time-consuming, but it is absolutely necessary. So why is vendor contract management so important? First, it's because it helps create a powerful and legally binding business relationship with this third party. It also helps increase spend visibility and transparency within your organization, as long as you're tracking that kind of information within the contract. And down the road, it could help identify potential cost savings as well, as long as you are tracking that information, again, within your contract management system. The contract is very important because it establishes the expectations of all parties involved in the contract and helps provide and enforce some way to ensure compliance against those expectations for both parties, you and your third party. And lastly, but certainly not least, is it helps you avoid missing any significant contract dates. Not every contract, not every relationship is extendable for one reason or another, so you certainly don't want to miss out on an opportunity to get out of a relationship when the time comes that you want to get out of it. So who is generally involved in writing contracts? And of course, with each of you, it could be different. And on this slide, you'll see a list of a variety of people that could be involved in the contract writing. And I think the point I want to make here is that there's probably some primary constituents, and then there's some others that you would want to collaborate with. And so depending, again, on how your organization is set up, how you have it structured in your governance documents, whatever the case is and that works and is appropriate for your organization, that it needs to be documented and followed. You may have a few others that you would bring into the process as it relates to service level agreements. My advice with that one would be that you need to be working with those who have the boots on the ground to help ensure that the right SLAs are covered in the contract. We're going to talk in just a few moments about critical vendors and some considerations, but this slide is speaking to the contract language that should be included in all vendor contracts, regardless of the risk, regardless of the criticality of that vendor, regardless of the size of the contract. These are some basic contract elements that should be covered and should, however you build your contracts, whether you're working with internal or external legal counsel or whatever means you are using, these are basic elements that you should not pass up on any contract that you are entering in with a partner of any kind.
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. Please remember, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This first poll question is, do you ensure that due diligence is done prior to executing third-party contracts? Always, regardless of third-party vendor risk, only for critical third-party vendors, sometimes dependent upon the vendor owner, or never. And Kelly, we have some time right now to answer one of the questions that has come in so far from the audience. And that question is, when should you consider a contract renegotiation with a third party?
A contract renegotiation. So I think what that's asking is for a contract that is in term, one that's not yet at contract expiration or termination date, when should you consider renegotiating that? So I'm hoping that that's what the question is. So what I'll say to that is, in my experience, you would typically want to approach a contract renegotiation when significant changes have occurred with this third-party vendor, even though it is mid-contract. Such things like maybe they had a material financial decline, or Maybe you encountered an audit or exam finding that was related to this vendor and their services. Maybe their services have materially degraded since you put the contract in place. Another reason might be if you're trying to maybe realign your cost with that vendor. Chances are, though, in situations like that, the ball is generally in the vendor's court. There may be other times, but I think the ones I mentioned are probably the ones that come closest to mind.
Thanks, everyone, for answering that poll question. Here are those results. By the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the Slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Before we move on, as a reminder, in the Related Content widget, you'll find our How to Write Fourth-Party Requirements into Your Vendor Contract infographic. Back to you, Kelly.
Okay, so let's turn our attention now to fourth-party vendors, also known as subcontractors or subprocessors. There may be other names, but those are the common ones. Make sure that you understand your relationship with a fourth party exists because you have a direct contractual relationship with a third party. And since you don't have a contractual relationship with the fourth party, it's important that you have a thorough understanding of your third party's risk management practices with their own vendors. To do that, you'll need to review your third party's vendor risk management policy, procedures, and any other documentation that will provide insight into the scope, rigor, and effectiveness of their program. If you find that their program doesn't operate to the standards you expect or require, you should insert additional contract clauses to ensure your expectations are clear and that they are met. We're going to cover some examples of those in just a few moments. You'll notice the side comment, 34% of those who responded to our 2023 third-party risk management survey do some form of assessment of their fourth party. So hopefully all of you are in that 34%. Okay, so for the next few slides, we're going to talk through some specific contract provisions that should be included in your contract with your third-party vendor that will ensure they are managing the risks appropriately with your fourth-party vendors. So again, let me say first that all of these contract considerations should already be a part of the contract with your third-party vendor, and if they aren't, you should start there. But I'm going on the assumption that they are included. And just like you would expect these standards from your third-party vendor, standards such as business continuity and business resumption, information security, compliance with laws and regs, ongoing monitoring requirements such as annual audits, etc., and other standards that you deem requirements from your third party, at minimum your critical and high-risk third parties, you should equally expect these third parties to have these standards in place with their vendors. So continuing on, just looking at some considerations to keep in mind as you are writing fourth-party requirements into your third-party contracts is being sure that you address how critical contractors, critical subcontractors are handled ongoing with that contract, your ability to audit your third-party vendor, which would extend into your fourth-party processes to support your third-party service, any adverse events, and how your third party is going to handle the notification of those events to you, and their ongoing monitoring requirements of their third-party vendor, of course, which is your fourth party. All of these you want to have considered into your contract. And let's finish this off. Here's four more that you need to consider making sure is covered in your third-party contract that your NDA covers down into your fourth party. Indemnity and insurance requirements also, when necessary, are carried forward into your fourth parties. Definitely right to perform activities offshore. This is a big one. So if you're not willing to have any activities offshore, then that absolutely needs to be addressed. And another really critical one today with the privacy laws is returning or destructing data, ensuring that if you have that covered with your third party, that it is reaching into your fourth party as well. At the end of this boot camp, like all of our webinars, you will be receiving or you will have access to this presentation and the recordings of this presentation. And included on this slide and the next slide are some examples of some contract clauses you might want to consider for fourth parties. You can find contract clauses through Google. Of course, if you have a legal team, obviously you would want to start there. But if you don't, Google is a great source. You can find many of these very easily. So on this page and on the next page, there are some examples of some fourth-party contract clauses that may come in handy. And here are a few other contract clause examples for fourth parties. Moving our attention now to contracts with critical vendors. Just a quick reminder that critical means that an impact on this vendor would have an immediate and direct impact on you. So these vendors can't be replaced quickly, and the loss in their service would significantly impact your business. So considering this, your organization really needs to be diligent in drafting, negotiating, and executing critical vendor contracts. These contracts should include legal requirements necessary to reduce or mitigate any material risk that you found during due diligence that's related to that business arrangement. These contracts should include clear and legally binding language written at a minimum reviewed by legal professionals or possibly even written by legal professionals. And these contracts should be structured in a format that's appropriate to the relationship. So it may include other related documents such as statement of works or some type of pricing tables or other documentation that is necessary to materially reflect the relationship. Let's talk about due diligence, and especially with critical vendor contracts, you should be performing an appropriate level of due diligence before you sign any contract with these critical vendors. Any issues that you uncover during that due diligence that requires remediation should be memorialized in the contract, including a timeline around that, evidence tracking, and ongoing monitoring of that particular issue and issues like that. If you don't do the due diligence first and you find issues that do require remediation, you've basically lost your legal leverage to force that remediation. With that said, though, you may find times where you just can't wait on the full due diligence before executing a contract. In cases like that, you should certainly include a contract clause that addresses how post-contract issues are to be remediated. From an ongoing monitoring standpoint, hopefully you have a formal vendor performance review process in place, and if so, periodically this performance review should include a review of the contract. Remember, I have mentioned this a couple of times, that contract management is not a one-and-done process. So there may come a time where you need to make some changes in that contract for a variety of reasons. Critical contracts need to be monitored for their expiration dates. I believe I've mentioned this a few times also. So you should be preparing for contract renewal or termination, whichever one you're going with that contract, at least 120 days before the end of the contract term. And while certainly not the most exciting thing you'll want to do, but you should inventory those contracts that mandate compliance with specific laws or regulations. A perfect example of this is the continuing change with data privacy and data security. We've had several requests for contract modifications to address those gaps. So being aware of these laws and being compliant with them with your contracts is very important. And I've already talked about the contract review process, so let's just focus on the storage and retrieval. Best to have a central repository for your contract so that the appropriate people, especially your vendor owners and others who need to have access to the contracts, can have access to them. Notes and records that are made up that led up to the signing of the contract, is important to have those stored with the contract as well. So if you don't have that central location in place, it's probably a good idea to think about making that a priority at some point. Now, this is a topic that I have limited experience on, but I feel like it's common sense. If you will be contracting with a foreign-based third party, then take these thoughts and tips into consideration. One, foreign courts and laws may differ, probably do differ substantially from U.S. courts and law. So especially as it relates to enforcing specific contract provisions such as data protection, privacy, choice of law, et cetera. Just keep that in mind that you're going into a very complicated contract arrangement. Secondly, you might find that foreign-based companies may not provide you the same information, that due diligence information that you need to review, that you're accustomed to getting from domestic companies, which could lead to some challenging contract negotiation. So for those reasons, and probably many more, it's really advised, strongly advised, that you seek legal advice as you begin working with a prospective foreign-based third party, and go into that relationship with the strongest legal arrangement that you possibly can, hopefully eliminating any misinterpreted or ambiguous contract language. In some instances, you may find the need to sign a contract and go into business with a vendor who refuses to participate in due diligence. Maybe they refuse to negotiate any terms and require you to sign their standard contract. Maybe they won't share critical information that you may want to review, such as financials or their BCP. There could be any number of reasons that they refuse to do that, but you still have a need to have a business relationship with them. In situations like that, it's just critical that you go into that relationship knowing what the risks are and have processes in place to manage and monitor those risks, as well as a very well-defined exit strategy, because life happens and these kinds of situations may indeed happen as well. And as we wind down talking about provisions and contracts with critical vendors, here's a few others that I may or may not have mentioned already. I feel like I've mentioned a couple of these, but just know that these contracts with your critical vendors should address right to audit, should address notification requirements for things like subcontractor changes, key personnel changes, business resumption and contingency plans, definitely insurance requirements and data retention and disposition procedures around contract termination. A disclaimer I want to state here is that everything I've mentioned up to this point about contract provisions is not intended to be exhaustive. There are likely other provisions depending on your industry that should be included for critical vendors, but hopefully this is a very good start.
Our second poll question of the day is, does your organization assess subcontractors or fourth-party vendors either directly or by reviewing your vendor's third-party risk management program? Yes, all fourth parties are reviewed. No, we don't review any fourth parties. C, some but not all fourth parties are reviewed, or not sure. Kelly, I have another question here that we can go ahead and answer. And that question is, what responsibility does my company have with managing our fourth parties?
Well, again, you don't have a contract relationship with those fourth parties, not a direct contract relationship anyway, but it is essential that you understand how your third-party vendors manage their risk with their vendors, which are your fourth parties. And you would certainly want to make sure that they are ultimately responsible in their contracts with their vendors to cover that risk. And the only way you're going to be able to make sure that they're doing that is to do a thorough review of your third party and their third party risk management program. So you're going to want to make sure that they have good policies and programs in place to ensure that their fourth parties are in good standing and that they have the regulatory requirements to monitor them, because it is a domino effect. You directly manage your third party, and as long as you do that appropriately, then you're obtaining the evidence that they in turn are managing their third parties effectively, which again are your fourth party. So it starts with you managing your third parties. You have the responsibility there. Their responsibility is with their third parties, which are your fourth parties.
Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. Before continuing, I'd like to direct your attention to our vendor contract renewals checklist available for download in the related content widget. This is a handy checklist to keep close by during contract renewals. Kelly, back to you.
Our last topic for this portion of today's boot camp is talking about exit strategy. So what is an exit strategy? Well, think for just a moment about these questions. What would happen if your vendor simply could not provide the service or the product to your company? What would the impacts be? What would the impact to your customers be? An exit strategy is considering in advance what might happen if your vendor suddenly ceased to exist. The exit strategy shouldn't necessarily detail all the steps and procedures, but it should be a high-level outline of the overall approach. Who should be involved? What is the time to implement a new vendor? What is the time to make the decision to exit this vendor? Critical and high-risk vendors should have an exit strategy to ensure that you can remain in operation if and when there's a need to off-board a vendor. And then testing that exit strategy is also a necessary step in this process. Why are exit strategies important? Well, first, most people don't go into a vendor relationship or any type of relationship for that matter, expecting it to fail and planning how to overcome that. But going into a business relationship, and in our case, a vendor relationship, that planning is simply a best practice. An exit strategy is your best insurance against any messy loose ends should you find that you do need to go your separate ways with that vendor. Unfortunately, exit strategies often do slip through the cracks. They're just hard to do. And without one in place, you put your company at risk for losing a critical vendor without a solution to replace them. So we're going to take a look at 5 things you should consider to improve your vendor exit strategy. And the first one is to establish an exit strategy and establish it early. If you followed best practices, you would have evaluated several vendors during the vendor selection process. What is the next best alternative for your company? During your vetting process, you would have identified a priority order. The vendor that came in second is likely a good alternative down the road, so keep their information nearby and keep in touch with them. Second, use a champion approach with your vendor. By that, what I mean is make it clear to your critical vendors that you do a continuous review of vendors as your contract comes up for renewal. So even though you may choose to stay with the vendor that you are with, you're going to always look at what's out there. Do a mini, M-I-N-I, mini vendor selection process each time a vendor contract is up for renewal so that you are doing what's best for your company. Again, it is a very sound business strategy to always know what vendor is the best one for you for that service, and it puts the vendor on notice as well that performance is being evaluated and that you have options. 3, evaluate your continuing service requirements that you expect from your vendor. An exit strategy should specify what service expectations you have as you transition away from that vendor. For example, what is the vendor's obligation to continue to provide specific levels of performance while you are transitioning off of them? The transition SLAs may be different than normal business SLAs. Will you require and will the vendor provide parallel services for a predefined period of time during the transition to a new vendor? Will you require additional assurances surrounding the confidentiality and availability of your data during that transition? And a really big one is, will there be additional fees or conversion fees, exit fees that will be associated with a transition to a new vendor? The key here is to make sure you have considered your expectations of how the vendor will service and support you during that transition and write it as best you can in the contract. The fourth consideration to improve your vendor exit strategy is to review the data security and privacy. Of course, maintaining data security and privacy is critical even at all times, and especially needs to be considered during the transition from one vendor to the next. So here's a few things to think about. Think about in the contract language accounting for a secure transfer of your organizational and customer data, as well as any other sensitive and private information that may exist. Account for a mutually acceptable and documented method of data destruction, and assure that the vendor has destroyed all and or removed all sensitive information from their systems and from your fourth-party systems to ensure that no data is left behind. And the last consideration in improving your vendor exit strategy is thinking about deconversion cost. At the time of contracting with the vendor, you'll need to consider if there is a financial impact of any termination with that vendor. You want to know that and think about that before you sign the contract. Deconversion costs or conversion costs should be specified in the contract up front. Things to consider is, are there any fees for early termination? Are there any is there a termination language for cause? What are the specific deconversion costs that you might experience from that vendor? Are there any costs to go to a new vendor as well? Are there any other additional fees, anything to do with data destruction? And can you expect a return of any of your prepaid fees? These are the final things to consider for improving your vendor exit strategy. Everything we've been discussing is that it is very important to think through and document these exit strategies at the time you are selecting a new vendor and service. It's a best practice to understand then what you might be facing if and when you decide to offboard or exit that vendor. So here are 4 common strategies, exit strategies that you could take. One is replace that vendor. That's also known as alternate. So you're going to find a new vendor who will you will offboard that vendor onto the new vendor. Bring the activity in-house. Maybe you've decided that you can absorb this activity now with your own staffing and your own solutions. Maybe you've decided to discontinue this activity altogether. So you're removing the dependency on this vendor or any vendor. Or you could have a combination of any of the 3 methods above. Okay, let's consider that something occurred that is requiring you to exit a vendor. Could be they went out of business, could be a natural disaster, could be any number of things. But to be prepared, here are 5 important steps to take prior to contracting with a critical vendor so that you are prepared. One is to discuss that exit strategy with the appropriate people in your organization that can help you put a plan together. 2 is to write out a detailed timeline of what would need to happen to minimize disruption to you and to your customers. 3 is to consider all the alternatives, whether it could be a slow unwind or a hasty plan that needs to be put into place quickly, but consider what those alternatives are. 4 is to have it reviewed and possibly tested, and 5 is to review that exit strategy on a periodic basis. So who would typically be involved in the exit strategy? There would be stakeholders both during the planning of that exit strategy and executing it. First, you need to know who is authorized to approve exiting a vendor or terminating a vendor. Is that something that senior leadership, are there cases that need to go to the board? Who will provide written notice to the vendor that you are terminating? That could be different for each of you. What termination activities are your responsibility and what termination activities are the responsibility of the vendor, and who's going to manage those responsibilities to ensure that the vendor is doing what they are responsible for doing in that process. Are there any open invoices for this vendor? Any past due payment? So you'll likely have some involvement from your accounts payable team to get to those answers. Who is responsible for updating the vendor database and archiving the vendor records after offboarding? Probably the contracting department or procurement or whomever it is that owns that part of your business. How will we manage issues? Likely there may be some outstanding issues that need to be resolved. So are there any delays in returning equipment or disconnecting systems or back to that data destruction? Did that get processed, and do you have the final documentation on that? So again, the important thing is knowing What stakeholders need to be involved to answer these very important questions during the offboarding or exit strategy with your vendors. Final note on exit strategy is about validating and testing it. It's an important part to validate and test that exit strategy that you are putting in place. And again, you're putting this in place at the beginning. So testing it may present a little bit of a challenge, but you do want to make sure you have thought through what that testing might look like. And here are a few things to take into consideration during that. When is an appropriate time to test? Who are you going to pull in to be a part of that test? And what are the objectives of the test? Again, switching to another vendor is not something that at the time you're putting this exit plan and exit strategy in place you hope to do, but just making sure you have enough structure around that process so that when that time does actually come, everybody has thought through what that would look like. That's what validation and testing of that exit strategy should look like. As I wind down my portion today, I want to just cover a few key takeaways. One is just to remind you that vendor contract management is the oversight of those written agreements with your vendors, and is a very important part of the life cycle. A fourth party exists through your relationship with your third party, and just to remind you, you don't have a contractual relationship with your fourth party. Contract language that you do have in place with your third party should contemplate some requirements that you have as it relates to how your third party is going to manage the fourth party that you have. And while it might be the last thing on your mind at that point, an exit strategy is your best insurance against any messy loose ends at the time you are putting a contract in place with a new vendor. So with that wrapped up, I will turn this back over to you, Jessie.
Great. Thanks so much, Kelly, for that informative session. Now I'd like to introduce Lisa Mayhill, who will discuss third-party risk management and supply chain. Lisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So in this session, we are going to talk about supply chain management. So what supply chain management is and how it fits into that third-party risk management. What the impacts of supply chain disruptions are, supply chains and the risk, and then just some key takeaways. We're just going to take a quick look at the risk management lifecycle to kick off our talk. Really, supply chain management and business continuity reviews are going to live solidly in ongoing monitoring. However, in many scenarios, supply chain management really should be part of your onboarding and vetting process as well. So supply chain disruptions and supply chain management have been all the buzz the last couple of years. I think personally and professionally, we've all felt the strain in one way or another. Even our annual State of Third-Party Risk Management 2023 showed that 39% of respondents had experienced some impact from a supply chain disruption in 2022. So understanding how your vendors respond to and plan for events throughout the supply chain is a critical component in their business continuity planning. When you assess your third-party vendors, you're going to want to know what vendors they consider critical and where they lie on that chain. You really need to understand all the risks that could threaten your organization's operations, and things like regulatory compliance, reputation, even those that are 3 links away from you. So a lot of times we think that supply chain doesn't impact us. And I think that's because we a lot of times think of supply chain kind of like physical logistics, things like manufacturing. Well, how does that impact us? When in reality, supply chain management is a part of your overall business continuity, and it's a part of your vendor's business continuity. So understanding how supply chain disruptions work and what they mean is important just in the overall business continuity management of your own business as well as your vendors. So some examples that are pretty common of industries that are heavily impacted by supply chain disruptions are going to be manufacturing, retail, and restaurants and food. That's not to say they're the only ones, but those are the ones that you see a lot of, especially in the news. So what is a supply chain disruption, right? So a disruption is going to be anything that's going to negatively impact the flow, creation, sale, or distribution of a product and service. Some examples of disruptions: disasters, right? The 2011 earthquake and tsunami resulted in $210 billion in costs for Japan, and it affected supply chains across the globe. They were unable to ship or receive any needed parts. So tech companies, as well as car manufacturers, they had shut down facilities in both the U.S. and Japan. Businesses reliant on the country's just-in-time deliveries were literally left in the lurch. Hurricanes. When Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico in 2017, the supply chain of two of the island's biggest industries, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, were completely destroyed. Hurricane Sandy touched down in New York in 2012. That exposed a really surprising fragility of New York Harbor's fuel supply chain. The storm impacted nearly every link in that chain. Foreign oil tankers were blocked by water debris. Refineries closed due to flooding. There was power cuts. Tanker trucks were commandeered by emergency vehicle or agencies. And then, of course, COVID-19. It's starting to be a memory, but we all know the impacts that had on the supply chain and companies' ability to do business. And COVID-19, I think, really brought out an awareness that it can vary depending on just different where you're located in different parts of the country. It doesn't even have to be a worldwide supply chain. And then, of course, most recently, the SVB Bank failure. SVB Bank was really part of a much larger supply chain, and the impact of that is still being sorted out as we speak. So a supply chain disruption can hit in all different areas. And that's before we even get into cyber incidents, things like the Okta hack, GitHub, Access Press, etc. Grand scale retail, healthcare. Feels like 100 years ago, but Tylenol recall in 1982, that was a huge deal. The Samsung Galaxy in 2016. And then, of course, most recently, automobile microchips in general. Obviously, supply chain disruptions can hit in all different ways. So understanding the impact is just critical.
Our next poll question is, do you consider supply chain management as part of your third-party risk management program today? Yes, no, or you're not sure. Lisa, let's go ahead and answer another question from the audience. And that question is, what is the difference between supply chain management and just regular business continuity due diligence?
That's a really great question. And really, supply chain management is just a part of business continuity planning. Business continuity is really about protecting your organization from disruption and having a solid plan to be able to continue to operate if a disruption should occur. So supply chain management means understanding where all the components of your business are. What's the workflow of what you need to operate? So understanding that piece is important because as organizations start to really outsource more and more aspects of their products and services, you need to understand where all those pieces exist to properly integrate them into your plan. And this is something that you may or may not already be doing without even realizing that it's a specific practice. So really, it's just all kind of part of an overall plan and a way to manage your business and manage, your vendors and make sure that all the pieces are fitting together properly and that you know when you're impacted. Because ultimately, you could have pieces of your processes or products that are made or created or managed all over the world. And so you just want to make sure that you're understanding that.
And here are those results. Thank you everyone for answering this question, as it is interesting to see what everyone says. Before we continue with our discussion on supply chain, I'd quickly like to mention that our State of Third-Party Risk Management 2023 white paper is available for download in the related content widget. You may have an interest in this white paper if you want to dive further into this topic, as it covers industry data around supply chain and third-party risk management, especially starting on page 40. Back to you, Lisa.
Okay, so how does third-party risk management offer visibility into your supply chain? Third-party risk management is really a practice that can help your organization identify supply chain risks and begin to mitigate them. And these are risks like geopolitical risk, ESG risk or environmental, social, and governance risk, modern slavery, corruption and bribery, and then risk to availability and business continuity. According to the State of Third-Party Risk Management 2023 white paper, 42% of respondents felt that third-party risk management has helped their organization avoid supply chain disruptions. It truly is a knowledge is power type of scenario. So when we talk about geopolitical risk, we're really talking about things that are typically disruptive global political events that occur in areas that impact organization suppliers. So an example of a geopolitical event is going to be countries in conflict, so such as U.S. and China tariffs, the war in Ukraine, understanding the geographic locations that are part of your and your vendor supply chain is going to help you adequately plan and react to geopolitical risk and incidents. Knowing where your stuff comes from is going to be really important. So ESG, or environmental, social, and governance, it's really the responsibility of businesses to detect and mitigate ESG practices within their supply chains. So ESG risk is really prevalent in worldwide supply chains that include raw materials such as or manufacturing and construction. However, it's often obscured by the complexities within those supply chains, multiple subcontracting relationships, corrupt third parties, etc. ESG risk is tough. So understanding what fourth-party vendors are critical to your vendors and where they are located and what piece of the supply chain puzzle that they are is important to managing ESG risk. So supply chain visibility is also going to help with insight into modern slavery and human trafficking. You want to ask questions about modern slavery in your vendor risk assessment questionnaire. Things like, is your vendor compliant with regulations restricting modern slavery? For example, the Modern Slavery Act of 2015 in the UK, or the Victims of Trafficking and Violence Prevention Act in the US. Does your vendor have a modern slavery and human trafficking statement? What is the vendor's process for identifying, assessing, and addressing unethical practices such as modern slavery in the organization and in the supply chain? These different risks that we talk about are so important as we continue to outsource outside of our own environment in our own country. Understanding where your products and services are being produced and operated from is all just a part of these different areas of visibility. Two common forms of corruption are bribery and fraud. Collusion can include bribes to ensure a supplier is awarded a contract or misrepresentation of goods and services. Corruption in the supply chain can lead to environmental issues, while aspects like human rights and worker safety also need to be considered. And then reputational risk makes it challenging to avoid if corruption in the supply chain is made public. And this could lead to issues with customers and suppliers in the future. So knowing how your vendors protect themselves against these risks allows you a level of confidence and assurance. So this slide is really just an overview of the UFLPA and how that compliance fits into third-party risk management. The Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, published the Strategy to Prevent the Importation of Goods Mined, Produced, or Manufactured with Forced Labor in the People's Republic of China, or the UFLPA. The U.S. Customs and Border Protection, or CPB, has also published a supplement to the DHS publication called the Operational Guidance for Importers. Really, to comply with the UFLPA, importers and manufacturers have to review their entire supply chain entities against the UFLPA entity list. And then they want to conduct supply chain due diligence that includes things like supply chain tracing and supply chain management measures. So just to wrap up this session, I want to talk about just some tips for monitoring your supply chain, what you can do. First and foremost, you want to perform your due diligence. So what that means is really understanding where your products and services are coming from. You want to identify the critical fourth parties. So what vendors is your vendor using? You might think it doesn't apply to you because you're very clear about where your specific vendors are sourcing any materials from. But what about their critical vendors? Because there's a responsibility there as well. You want to define supply chain expectations during contracting. Discuss the supply chain with your vendor. For individual vendors, for example, request copies of vendor codes of conduct, their third-party risk management policies and procedures. You can require proof of risk assessments and monitoring, as well as copies of their modern slavery statements and policies. Conduct audits of the supply chain operations to find out how labor and materials are sourced and the prices paid to suppliers further down that supply chain. And then you want to create a supplier code of conduct. Create a supplier code of conduct. Implement written policies for suppliers that clearly outline standards and expectations for ethical behavior surrounding things like labor, health, safety, and the environment. Along with a written code of conduct, suppliers can benefit from training that explains their contractual obligations to comply with ethical business standards and practices. And then monitor your vendors. Set up news alerts for your vendors and their industry. Use subscription-based risk monitoring and alert services to provide vendor risk intelligence. Include supply chain discovery in your regular ongoing monitoring. Set up ESG news alerts for your vendors and their industries. Ultimately, all of these tips are from a proactive standpoint, right? You want to make sure you're having these conversations with your vendor. You want to make sure you're setting clear expectations from the get-go, and you want to make sure that you're not turning a blind eye to things that you don't think are your problem down the line. It's really about having those discussions and being as proactive as possible.
Before we move on to our next session, where Lisa will discuss vendor data breaches, we're going to take a quick 10-minute break. Please meet us back right here in 10 minutes. You do not need to close out and log back in. Just simply leave everything as is. Welcome back, everyone. We are now going to move into our next session, which is an understanding of vendor data breaches. We are joined again by VendMinder's Lisa Mayhill, Information Security Operation Director. Lisa, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, great. Let's get started. So today we're going to talk about some notable data breaches. What is vendor cybersecurity posture? What to do if your vendor suffers a breach, and then best practices when handling data breaches. Okay, so when we talk about data breaches and cybersecurity in the context of third-party risk management lifecycle, where does it fit? Well, truly assessing cybersecurity to protect against data breaches is going to occur in both the onboarding and ongoing stages of the life cycle. You want to look at it right from the beginning, and then you want it to be part of that reassessment, that monitoring, those renewals. So it really fits into both. So I don't think anything on this slide is going to be shocking to anybody. Data breaches are on the rise. Obviously, cybersecurity is a big deal. According to our annual State of Third-Party Risk Management white paper that we recently came through, 70% of our survey respondents rated cybersecurity as a top concern. I think that we expect that. Data breaches continue to increase. There's giant ones that you hear about every day. There's tiny ones that you may not hear about, but hackers are getting more creative. If the data breach is reported in the last few years or anything to go by, then really any organization servicing consumer data should be striving towards stringent information security and physical security controls. It's not a matter of if an organization is going to be hacked, but when it will be hacked. And failed cyber attacks are noted on a daily basis, if not hourly. So according to many industry contacts, there's so much going on underneath that radar that if you only think about the big ones that you hear about in the news, it's bad enough. But if you take into context all the things that you don't know about and you don't hear about, it's mind-blowing. Okay, so here is a slide with just very small sampling of 2023 vendor data breaches. So if you think about it, we're halfway through April. These three on this slide were just from the first quarter alone, and this is just three. There were also Chick-fil-A, Twitter, JD Sports, Ferrari. There's so many more that had bad breaches just in Q1 of 2023. And the three on this slide are big ones. These are ones that you, I'm sure, heard about in the news, had impact to a large number of consumers, PII, PHI. So really, you know, it's in the news every day. So we know that it's something to be watching for. We know it's something that we need to be paying attention to. So when we talk about breaches, we also have to look at what's in place today from a regulation standpoint to protect our privacy as consumers. Currently, 6 states, California, Virginia, Colorado, Connecticut, Iowa, and Utah have enacted comprehensive consumer data privacy laws, with California having 2. They all have several similar items, items in common, controls in common, such as the right to access and delete personal information, the right to opt out of the sale of personal information. More states are following suit. There are still many states kind of waiting in the wings, hoping for a federal law that will keep things a little more cohesive and clearer across the board. But 19 other states have active bills on the floor, with several look to be passed relatively soon. The IAPP has a really great legislation tracker. It's the blue link on this slide, and it really is up to date in real time. It's a great resource if you're trying to kind of keep track of the privacy laws, see what's out there, what's coming up. I would highly recommend checking out this link for the IAPP. It's a really great resource. So the next handful of slides, I'm just going to talk kind of briefly about vendor cybersecurity posture and what that means, why it's important. When we talk about your vendor's cybersecurity posture, what we really mean is your vendor prepared to prevent, detect, and respond to a cybersecurity issue or event. A lot of organizations are investing in their own cybersecurity programs, but are often forgetting to invest in ensuring that their vendors are doing that same thing through their third-party risk management program. So to help identify whether your vendor's posture is appropriate, you first want to identify the cyber threats that your vendor could present to you and take proactive steps to mitigate those potential areas of weakness. And to do this, you have to perform risk assessments to determine the threats and vulnerabilities that your organization faces by using each of your vendors. Then you want to take the necessary steps to determine whether your vendor and your customers' data is or will be secure. And prior to signing a contract, you want to make sure you're doing that proper due diligence. It should be performed at the very beginning stages and then throughout your ongoing monitoring. And then you want to make sure you review if and how your vendor is prepared to prevent, detect, and respond to an actual event, and then what happens if it happens. So why is it important? Well, ultimately, it's going to enable your risk mitigation by allowing you to influence your vendor to strengthen their controls, right? It allows you to say, hey, I need you to do this. By having all that knowledge up front, by assessing that in the beginning, you'll know what you need to do to supplement their controls, what you expect from them, and then make a decision on whether you want to stay with them. And of course, it's a hot button issue for all regulators. We know this. It's required that you demonstrate that you're taking proactive steps to identify and mitigate potential areas of weakness with your vendors. You're expected to cover that CIA information security triad. A vendor breach can have a huge impact on you. Reputational risk is a big deal. Ultimately, the domino effect is real. A chain is only as strong as its weakest link. I could use a lot of cliches here, but really industry best practice and regulatory guidance wants you to consider all the potential ramification posed by a third party. Cybersecurity is a big piece of that. We'll talk about that and then breaches right after this poll question.
And this brings us to our first poll question after our break. Was your organization a victim to any recent data breaches? Yes, no, somewhat, or not sure. Lisa, while we wait for the results to tabulate on this one, we can answer another question from the audience. And that question is, am I responsible for things like providing credit monitoring to customers if my vendor was the one with the breach?
That's a good question. So technically, probably not. It is a show of good faith, and it allows your clients and customers to feel a sense of that, you're in it together. And confidence that you're doing the right thing. The vendor that was breached may also offer the same as part of their recovery. But oftentimes a customer will feel better about accepting something like that from you versus some vendor that they didn't even know existed. And it also really demonstrates that you're taking it seriously and that you've had a plan in place for these things, that you weren't blindsided, that you know what to do in this type of scenario. And frankly, I feel like anything that you can do that helps maintain your reputation and shows that you're actively part of the solution is a good thing. And you have to worry about your reputation just as much as you have to worry about your data these days. So technically, no. Is it the right thing to do? Probably.
Thanks, Lisa. And as a reminder, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for the session number 4, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. We will be closing this poll shortly. Thanks. Okay, everyone, here are those results. Thank you for submitting your responses. Before we move on, as a reminder, in the related content widget, you'll find our 10 best practices when handling a vendor data breach infographic. This resource walks you through how to handle a vendor data breach. Lisa, back to you.
So I mentioned a few slides back the CIA Information Security Triad. This is really just a reference slide. CIA stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Cybersecurity is really based on this triad of areas of knowledge. So when we talk about the CIA Information Security Triad, this is what we're talking about. So when dealing with cybersecurity risk and the risk of breach, we need to understand what type of vendors need to be reviewed. We know that we can't review every single vendor at the same level. So at a minimum, you should be reviewing your high and critical risk vendors. How do you determine which vendors are high or critical risk? You want to make sure to ask yourself two simple questions. Does the vendor process, store, or transmit non-public customer data such as PII, PHI? Second, does the vendor provide a part of your service that would degrade your service's value if it was unavailable? Once you determine which vendor you'll review, you're going to want to determine who performs those reviews. On the cybersecurity side of due diligence, you really want someone with demonstrable knowledge across information security to perform your reviews. You're going to want somebody with experience so that the review doesn't turn into a checkbox activity. It probably isn't going to be your third-party risk manager directly, but more likely a supporting resource from an internal information security team. And if these resources aren't available within your organization, you should look to a third-party risk management service provider for assistance. And then when we talk about qualifications, you really want someone with a broad background in information security and risk management or an experienced information security professional because they're going to be the ones that really know how things are implemented and how they should be. Okay, so when we talk about best practices, we came up with just kind of a list of the 10 best practices when handling a data breach. You want to be transparent. First and foremost, everybody understands that acknowledging a breach is painful. It is not what you want to do. But the mistrust and reputational damage that can come by just sitting on it will outweigh putting it off, 100%. Whether the breach was with you or a vendor, advice is the same. You want to make sure that you have solid data breach notification requirements in your contract language with your vendors. The reason being is because you want to be able to have as much time up front as possible to be transparent. So you want to make sure that you communicate that expectation with your vendors at the contract and renewal stages. A lot of organizations have shared with us that they have a high level of mistrust between their third parties because they're not confident they would get notified. So making sure that that's contract language, that you talk about that, you have those discussions is paramount. And you want to make sure that you tell the right people. When a breach happens at your vendor or at your home base, you have people you have to then notify. So when required, that might be the state AG or law enforcement, regulators, clients, customers. So again, having that contract language be clear and concise so you have the right expectations is going to be really important to meeting those objectives. And next, you really want to be able to define the impact of the breach. Understand what you're dealing with. Was the breach isolated to just one individual, or did it impact a lot of customers and consumers? You want to make sure that you have a customer notification process in place. Even if the breach happens as a third party, you want to make sure that you have a notification process for your customers if it was their data. It's best to be the one to notify the impacted customers directly than have them just hear about it down the line on the news or from that third party and not understand the correlation. We also recommend offering credit monitoring services. Ultimately, the organization that had the breach will probably do the same, but it's a show of good faith. Any data breach that contains non-public information of a customer is going to increase their risk of identity theft, so it really demonstrates good faith if you put that out there for them. And then you have to start reacting. You're going to need to implement more robust user authentication procedures. And this should be done especially if customers have access to online tools. So starting to look at what you need to do is going to be your next step. And that kind of rolls right into the last 3 best practices. Even if the breach happened elsewhere, you really want to perform that root cause analysis, enhance your security controls. Lightning does strike twice, so there is the potential for it to happen again. The worst thing you can do is not learn from it. The best thing you can do is to use it as an opportunity to build a stronger information security system. And that means setting expectations with your vendors. If the breach originated from them and not your internal organization, then you need to have the right to do that deep audit testing. That should be set in your contract language as well. If something happens, what are you allowed to do? If the vendor is unwilling to cooperate, then you may have larger issues. You might want to reconsider that partnership. If a vendor is not willing to work with you to ensure that these kinds of things don't happen again, that's something to really think about. And then, of course, you want to perform an internal assessment on your overall information security processes. Document all updates. Implement refresher training from your employees. Use it as an opportunity to strengthen your internal policies and procedures as well. And all of these steps together are really going to help you handle a data breach the best that you can in a worst-case scenario.
Thanks so much, Lisa, for that informative session. Lisa is now going to continue the conversation with a discussion on complementary user entity controls within vendor SOC reports. Lisa, back to you.
Okay, so let's get started. In this session, we're going to do a quick overview of different SOC report types. Then we're going to touch on complementary user controls within the SOC reports. Looking at common examples of CUEs in a SOC report, how to review vendor CUEs, and then tips for mapping CUEs back to your own controls. Okay, so when we talk about the third-party risk management lifecycle as it relates to CUEs and SOC report reviews, really this is, can occur in both the onboarding and ongoing stages of the lifecycle. Naturally, we look at SOC reports as part of that onboarding process, so CUEs, of course, go hand in hand with that. And then ongoing when we're talking about monitoring and performance, renewals, due diligence, reassessments, you're going to do solid SOC reviews and really re-review those CUEs in that ongoing process as well. So CUEs and SOC report reviews really fall into both onboarding and ongoing. So the next several slides are really going to be kind of a brief overview of SOC reports, just to kind of get us into the mindset of where CUEs are. So first and foremost, you know, there are a handful of different kinds of SOC reports. You're going to do kind of be seeing a lot of SOC 1s and SOC 2s. Obviously, those are the most common. We're seeing SOC 2 pluses now, SOC 3s, and of course, SOCs for cybersecurity are a new one that we see relatively infrequently, but they're, you know, we're seeing more and more of those. But this slide here is really just to summarize the various types of SOC reports that you'll most commonly see and just give you kind of a brief overview, and we'll look at a couple of them throughout the next couple slides. So out of those top 5 that we just talked about briefly on the previous slide, really the most common SOC reports that you're going to come across are going to be SOC 1s and SOC 2s. SOC 1 reports are intended to be used to validate and verify that internal controls over financial reporting are sufficiently in place at the vendor for your contracted use. You want to review this SOC when you're primarily concerned about the impact of financial reporting. And these SOCs are generally meant for auditor use and compliance purposes. A SOC 2 report is going to help you measure how the vendor provides their product and service under the umbrella of specific trust service criteria. That trust service criteria includes security, availability, confidentiality, privacy, and processing integrity. A SOC 2 may not cover all of those trust service criteria. Vendors actually can choose which criteria to be audited on as long as security is included. The audience for a SOC 2 is a bit wider than SOC 1s, and most of the time the SOC 2 is really the report you're going to want. It most definitely is the report that you're going to want from an IT vendor. A SOC 2 is really the only audit and report that defines a consistent set of criteria specifically around products and services that a company provides to you. So if you want to measure how your vendor is providing you a secure, available, confidential, and private solution, then the SOC 2 is the way to go. If ever asked, which do I pick between a SOC 1 and a SOC 2 if a vendor has both, always go for that SOC 2 if you can only pick one, just because it's going to be more robust, it's going to be more information security focused. Okay, so when we talk about SOC 1s and SOC 2s, we also need to kind of mention the different types that they can come in. Each SOC can be done as a type 1, which is going to cover a point in time, or a type 2, which is going to be performed over a period of time, typically 6 to 12 months. Since type 1s are only a point in time, generally you're not able to determine the operating effectiveness of controls. You really get to only see that they've been designed and implemented controls. A type 2 is going to give you both, because it's going to show you the controls and then also if they're working. If you look at these examples here, type 1 is a quick summary, a type 2 is a quick summary, and then the SOC 2 can also come in a SOC 2 Plus. This is a relatively recent option. It's really taking a SOC 2 and combining it with other control frameworks like the Cloud Security Alliance's Cloud Controls Matrix, or very commonly is the High Trust Common Security Controls. We're actually seeing a lot of those. And these are, again, called SOC 2 Pluses. They've actually been around for a while, but they're just now becoming more and more popular. We're seeing them a lot this year alone, so something to keep your eye out on. And it's really a way to combine that trust service criteria with another audit framework, making kind of a more valuable report, and obviously gaining some audit efficiencies with testing like mapped controls all at once. So these last two to touch on, the SOC 3 and the SOC for cybersecurity, a SOC 3 is good for early vetting, really during that vendor selection process. And it's essentially a summary of a SOC 2, and it comes with a seal of approval. One advantage of a SOC 3 to a vendor is that they can publicly share the report, so they don't need NDAs, there's not as much red tape. The downside, though, is that SOC 3s do not include actual control activities or testing performed. So what you're getting isn't as comprehensive. You're basically getting the very beginning of a report, the narrative, the informational part. It's designed to be made available publicly. So it's really less technical. It's going to have fewer details. You're going to want to request a SOC 1 or SOC 2 as part of your due diligence. You should never use a SOC 3 as the only report or control evidence that you review, because it does not show you if things are in place or operating. SOCs for cybersecurity, you really can request these when you want to know how mature and effective a vendor's cybersecurity risk management program is. Not every company has them, and so it shouldn't be a red flag or a negative mark for them if they don't. They're still kind of coming out with them. They're still kind of figuring out how to best use them. But if they do have a SOC for cybersecurity available, definitely worth reviewing and assessing. Okay, now that we have kind of the various type of SOC reports down, we're going to just quickly look at the anatomy of a SOC report and its key components, because this all ties into CUEs and where to find them and the importance of them. Understanding the SOC report as a whole is paramount to understanding CUEs and implementation. So section 1 of a SOC report is going to be that auditor's report. You're going to find the key information, such as who the audit firm is, whether it's a carve-out or inclusive report, the scope, auditor's opinion. Section 2 is going to be the organization management assertion. This section essentially is just the organization saying that they're going to work with the auditors in good faith. It talks about what they expect to put forth in the report. And then section 3, this is the description of the system. This is the narrative, the meat. Here you're going to find the organization's representation of the system as and what's in scope. It will talk about what's out of scope or what's explicitly carved out in most cases. And it's going to address a lot of topics, including risk management, an overview of the organization's operations, information about each control objective. And sometimes audit firms will put the complementary user entity controls right in this narrative as well. So that's why understanding each section is important, because CUEs can really pop up in different areas. So section 4 is the actual layout of control objectives and activities along with testing and results of testing if it's a type 2. And section 5, which is an optional section, is really kind of an FYI section. It's filled with things that are not tested. It's not in every report. Some audits, the SOC audits don't have them, some do. Common contents of this area would be the business continuity and disaster recovery information. Section 4, where your control testing is another area that you may find your CUEs, your complementary user entity controls listed. So you just want to be aware of that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes.
Our next poll question is, how valuable are SOC reports to your third-party risk management program? A key component, nice to have, you're indifferent, we don't ask for SOC reports, or you're not sure. And Lisa, here's another question from the audience. Do we really need to put into writing that we are implementing CUECs?
Absolutely. I know that it can feel like just another thing you have to do, and regulators do ask about this, and documenting it is really the only way that you can truly demonstrate in a tangible way that you're complying with the specific CUEs easily and quickly. It also, I think, helps you as an organization make sure you aren't missing anything, missing any steps or controls that you need to put in place. So while you're reviewing them, the best thing to do is to just put them down on paper. So, for example, when we do SOC assessments for our clients, we automatically build a CUE table right within our assessment, and it's super simple, but it allows for just 3 columns, one for the CUE, one to name who's responsible for it, and one to document how the CUE is implemented. It's a quick table, but it helps allow for easy documenting and a quick reference for when things need the follow-up. And that is an easy solution that you can implement relatively quickly. But it also allows for you to make sure that you're assigning CUEs to the right people, to the right parts of your organization, and have accountability. And so by documenting it, you're first making sure you don't miss anything, 2, showing accountability both internally and to regulators, and having solid documentation if something goes awry. So yes, it's another step, but I definitely think you should be documenting.
Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. Before continuing, I'd like to direct your attention to our Reviewing and Understanding a Vendor's SOC Report Interactive Guide and ebook in the related content widget. If you're looking for a walkthrough of reviewing a vendor SOC report, this interactive guide and ebook has you covered. I'll hand it back to you, Lisa.
Okay, so getting back into the content of a SOC report and what you're looking at, really the system description, the key components here are just making sure that you have the correct report. Before you can even get to the CUEs, you want to make sure that you're looking at the right thing. So the system description of a report is going to detail to you what services and products are provided. A lot of vendors have a lot of reports, and each report or each product that they have a report for may have different complementary user entity controls. So you want to make sure that you're validating that system description. You're verifying that you have the right report. Starting there is going to be important because you want to make sure that when you start to look at those CUEs that you're looking at the right ones for your organization and the product or service that you're using from that vendor. The next area to take note of is going to be your vendor subservice organizations. The key components of subservice orgs are really that they're service providers used by your vendor, so your fourth parties, And the report should clarify exactly how fourth parties and subservice organizations are used. They're usually representative either inclusively or with a carve-out method, most often using the carve-out method. The next area is the opinion section, and really there are 4 types of opinions: unqualified, qualified, disclaimer, and adverse. And this slide here really just goes over each of those opinion types. Okay, so in the actual audit part of the SOC, you're going to find the control objectives, and then later you'll find controls and tests, exceptions, and then exceptions can either pass or fail. You might find significant deficiencies, material weaknesses. This slide is really just to summarize the different areas of the test of controls and the evaluating results. This section is also a place where you may find CUEs. So where auditors create tests for activities, you may find the CUEs right aligned in there with each individual control. So if you have time later on, you can go back and take a look at this slide, and it kind of just gives you a general overview of evaluating results. So this slide here is really just a visual representation of the overall impact of opinions and exceptions and how everything kind of fits together when you're talking about a SOC report. You really want to determine the impact to your organization from any exceptions that you may have found, the response that was given, and whether there were mitigating or compensating controls in place that kind of limit the impact of those exceptions. So just understanding how those pieces fit together is going to be a key part of your overall SOC review. So again, this is just a visual aid to kind of talk through that. And finally, before we jump into complementary user entity controls, just want to make a quick note about control design. One aspect of SOCs that many users just don't know is that the organization being audited, your actual vendor, is the one that writes and designs the controls, not the auditor. So control wording is included within the audit report, as are the tests that the auditor performed. And in reviewing the report in detail, you can kind of better determine the value of that report as a whole to you. There are guidelines. Auditors do assist as needed, but the depth of each control is determined by the vendor. So it's just something to keep in mind as you go through. Not all SOC reports are created equally, and control complexity can really vary greatly between vendors. And this is also true in CUEs. You may get very detailed CUEs, and you may get very general CUEs. So just keep in mind that there is that kind of ebb and flow of information. Okay, so complementary user entity controls, or CUEs, or CUECs, or CUECs, or we're even seeing them called responsibilities, not controls. So what are they? So complementary user entity controls, which I call CUEs, are also known as user control considerations. These are controls that the vendor has included within its system in which the user entity, which is you, have to implement to ensure that the vendor's control objectives are accomplished. So in other words, it's basically what you have to do to make sure that that product and service works. In most cases, control objectives are stated in the description, can only be achieved in the correct situation. So the CUEs have to be suitably designed and operate effectively by your organization and function in combination with the vendor's controls. So it's kind of like what you have to do to make sure their controls work. It is definitely an identification of responsibility. CUEs are documented within a SOC report in different ways, like we talked about earlier. And it's usually depending on the preference of the vendor and the audit form performing the SOC review. So you can find them in multiple locations. So understanding how they're called out is helpful, and really just understanding what to look for. So what are some key components of CUEs? Again, they're controls that the user entity must have in place as part of the service provider's control environment. And you really have to review them annually and document that you're in compliance, especially if you're subject to SOX or FDICIA. A quick high-level overview of reviewing QEs is look at associated control objectives, determine which ones apply, assign each QE to a role or responsibility, determine which QEs are already addressed, address each applicable QE, record how each QE is addressed, and then assess the QEs on an ongoing basis. And we're going to talk a little bit about each of these more in depth. So QEs oftentimes run in a really common path. So you'll see a lot of commonality amongst QEs across products and services. Common examples of QEs that you'll find in a SOC report are going to be those surrounding logical access, like account provisioning, general IT controls and policies, account management, termination procedures, separation procedures like timely account removal, regular assessments of accounts, authorization policies and procedures. These can ensure that transactions are appropriately authorized, so transactions that are secure, timely, complete. You'll see QEs that surround data transmission policies and procedure, appropriate methods such as encryption that should be used to protect data during transmission. These four categories are the ones we see the most often. There's obviously other QEs outside of these, but you'll kind of see a pattern as you go along looking through SOC reports of the ones that really pop out more often than not. Okay, so when we talk about where to find QEs, we talked about this a few slides before. Really, there's a couple of spaces that you'll see it. In the description or tested control section of your vendor SOC report are going to be your two most common areas to find it. QEs that are found in the description section, or section 3, include details on controls and how they relate to the control objectives found within the report. This subsection is often found toward the end of the description section, and QEs may also be found in the tested control section, which is tested 4, or even sometimes section 5 of the SOC report. Controls may even be documented with the control objectives to which they are mapped specifically. So in the tested control section, you might find control CC 1.6, and directly below that, if there is a QE associated with that control, you might see it stuck right in there in section 4. So really, you have to keep your eye out. Like I said on the previous slide, specific subsection of the description is also a place you might find QEs listed right directly with the control objectives so that it shows kind of that mapping. And again, back in that tested control section, you may see it aligned right with the control objection as it's being tested. So various different parts of the report, and really finding the QEs in the report is only part of the battle. You have to make sure that you understand them and how to implement them. And we're going to talk about that in a few minutes right after our poll question.
We are to our last poll question of the day. And that question is, does your organization currently review CUECs as part of your vendor SOC report reviews? Yes, no, or not sure. Lisa, another question is coming from the audience that I think we have some time to answer. And that question is, I have been seeing CSOCs in SOC reports lately. What's the difference between those and CUECs?
These are really great questions. So what's interesting is, first I want to just draw out that there's a lot of different ways that people call them. Some people call them CUECs, some people call them QEs, some people call them CUECs. There's all different ways to say it, but really what they are is they're controls that you, the user of a product or service, are responsible for. Some places are even calling them CUERs, or calling them responsibilities versus controls. But what they are is it's what you are responsible for as the person or the organization using a product or service. CSOCs, or CSOCs, are controls that the organization expects to be fulfilled by the subservice organization, which is also your fourth party. This is a relatively new part of SOC reporting. It came out with the newest iteration of the SSAE, and it's important for you to review them simply because it clearly calls out and identifies what your vendor says they are outsourcing to someone else. So a good example of this is data centers. You'll see CSOCs that reference environmental controls or physical controls because their data center is being provided by a subservice organization. So the difference is what you're responsible for versus what your fourth party is responsible for. Both important to review. Definitely need to have that information.
And on your screen now, you can see those results for the final poll. Thank you, everyone, for answering this question. Before we move on, please be aware that our SOC 1 versus SOC 2 Rich Report to Request From a Vendor Infographic is available to download in the Related Content widget. Back to you, Lisa.
Okay, so how do you look at these CUEs? So you found them, you've pulled them out, you understand what they are, and so now what? So the very first thing you want to do is you want to make sure that the CUEs and their associated control objectives are reviewed by someone who's qualified, someone who understands the use of that product and service, and that they understand the context of the control, the technical business or technical and business impact of implementation. You want to make sure it's somebody who understands how they connect to your organization and the product and service that you're using of that vendor. And not all CUEs are going to apply. So you need to be able to determine which CUEs apply to you. And that's really based on your implementation of that product or service. So again, having somebody who understands the connection and the context is going to be key. And you want to be able to assign each CUE to a person or a team or a role for responsibility. It's really important that CUEs get assigned to a specific role in your organization so that they don't get lost. Things like turnover, employee changes, et cetera, can really have these kind of documentation pieces get lost in the shuffle. So having role accountability ensures that you're always going to be covered. And then you want to determine which CUEs you're already addressing, because in reality, in many scenarios, you're probably already doing a lot of these things like termination procedures and access management. And those are easy wins, so you want to just grab them when you can. That's low-hanging fruit that just makes the process much easier. So steps 1 through 4 are going to help you whittle down to just those CUEs that really matter to you and your organization, and that's what you have left to address. Those are your applicable CUEs. And truly, one of the most important parts of this is recording how each CUE is addressed. There are some questions that you can ask yourself. Is this CUE similar to any of your organization's existing controls? Who owns that control and takes responsibility for it? How often is the control validated or tested for effectiveness? And then really you have to make sure that you're assessing CUEs with each new SOC report or with any significant internal changes. CUEs are not always stagnant, so they should always be reviewed with each SOC cycle. So this means that if your vendor that you use a product or service for puts out 4 SOC reports a year, quarterly, which some do, you should be reviewing those CUEs with each iteration of that SOC report, because you're not sure if it will change or not, and you want to make sure that you're ahead of that. If your vendors or the provider of your service only puts out 1 SOC report a year, then you just have to review those CUEs once a year to make sure that there are no changes. And then, of course, number 8, most important, document, document, document. Make sure you record this work. Auditors, regulators are asking for evidence of CUE implementation. So create some type of way to document that you are doing the CUEs and that you are assigning them and that you're implementing them. And so just a few tips for mapping those CUEs. It's your organization's responsibility to ensure that you're meeting regulatory and contractual requirements with your controls. So mapping CUEs to those requirements and then analyzing what other requirements have you not yet been fulfilled is going to be key to this process. Mapping CUEs to appropriate business units is going to ensure that controls are implemented by the proper subject matter experts, or SMEs. And so consider which department would be most knowledgeable about each control and who would be able to best accomplish that control objective. It's not about making it a checkbox activity. It's making sure you have the right people doing the right work. So assigning the implementation of CUEs to a SME is going to provide you the best assurance that the control objective is effective, and that really is going to ensure security. And when mapping the controls to your organization, make sure the activities you're implementing are also included in your governance documentation. This is going to help aid with consistency and accountability. And remember that CUEs are designed to give your organization confidence that security is not compromised by your vendor relationships. So it's really giving you an ounce of control back. Okay, so finally, just kind of wrapping up with some key takeaways. Really, you want to understand the SOC you're reviewing. That's first and foremost. That's why we spent a few minutes kind of going over that SOC, because you want to understand SOC reports as a whole to see how CUEs kind of fit in there. You also want to understand the product and service it covers, how you use that product or service, making sure that you're seeing the context in the big picture. And then once you're into that SOC report, where are the CUEs? Understanding where they can be, determining what you're responsible for, and making sure that the person that's reviewing the CUEs has that same context, understands your organization's relationship, and understands the types of controls that are being asked of you. And then add CUE review to your ongoing monitoring process. CUEs change. So don't let them be a one and done. It shouldn't just be done at onboarding. It needs to continue through with ongoing monitoring. And then, of course, document, document, document. If you didn't write it down, you didn't do it. And regulators, auditors, they're asking for evidence of CUEs more and more. So having that available, having a process in place and a documented template or table for them is really going to be key to having some confidence that you are implementing them, both for you and for regulators. Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I would like to thank everyone for attending our second day of boot camp. I would also like to thank our experts from today, Kelly and Lisa, for their time in sharing some really important information on vendor contracts, supply chain and third-party risk management, data breaches, and vendor SOC reports. Tomorrow, on the third and final day of the boot camp, we will be joined around the campfire by VinMinder's Head of Third-Party Risk Education and Advocacy, Hillary Dewhurst, who will discuss ESG, Is Your Organization Ready? Then we will be joined by Raman Zachariah, VinMinder's Chief Financial Officer, who will discuss financial health in today's business climate. After a quick break, Jill Sherman, VinMinder's Third-Party Risk Principal, will cover the importance of vendor performance management, and Jill will be followed by Hillary once again to wrap up with program metrics and reporting and third-party risk management. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during today's sessions. Okay, Kelly, this next question will come to you. And that question is, what does a periodic review of the vendor to include a contract review include?
Well, and I'm sure you've heard about this through your sessions yesterday and other webinars, but a periodic review of your vendor, of course, includes your annual review of their documentation, where you are gathering those SOC documents that Lisa just talked about, if they have those, or other documents that you're reviewing where you're determining the overall health and risk of that vendor. So you're likely doing another risk assessment to update all of that critical information. And during that time, you should also be reviewing the contract. You should be confirming you know what the contract dates are. Are you intending for that contract to continue? Are you coming up on an expiration date? Are they performing? So you want to be sure that you're looking at if there are service level agreements, that you're monitoring their performance to see if they are adhering to the contract. This might be a time too that you take a look at those various provisions in the contract that may be missing. Things change. Privacy laws is a good example that continue to change. So if it is an older contract, that's something you would certainly want to take a look at. And this is, I think I talked about this in my session, where there could be times where you would want to renegotiate the contract. So these would be the types of things you would identify in your periodic review of your vendor to include your vendor contract. I think those are some good examples and reasons and explanation of what a periodic review, including the contract, is. Jessie?
Thanks, Kelly. Lisa, we'll come over to you for this next question. And that question is, how do you go about requesting a list of fourth parties from your third party?
That's a great question. So, you know, ultimately it's about the concept of knowledge is power, right? So you need to be able to have those discussions with your vendor. From a paperwork standpoint, usually you can identify critical fourth parties or nth parties from a SOC report review. That's a really good place to start, because those critical subservices that are listed in those SOC reports are the first fourth parties that you really want to focus on, because those are going to be the ones that your vendor is saying, hey, we need these guys to provide this good or service to you. And so if they need them, then you need to understand the risk that they present. So if you can't get it simply by asking your vendor, you know, hello, do you have any critical subservices that impact your ability to provide us this good or service that we're contracted for? And starting in their SOC report is a great place. But really, it should be a part of that dialogue. And like Kelly's been saying, with a proactive approach to contracts, you know, you want to have those discussions up front. Let them know that you want that information. Build that into your relationship because you are responsible for them.
Great. Kelly, we'll come back to you for this next question.
Okay.
What is a transition clause and when is it used?
A transition clause is language that you would have in the contract that is addressing what happens at the end of the contract. So it is addressing offboarding of that vendor, and especially it should be addressing what happens with all of your data that was a part of that contract and relationship. In this day and age, there's not too many relationships that you have with vendors where they don't have some type of critical information, private information. And you want to make sure that you get that back. You also just want to make sure that when that contract ends, when your relationship with that vendor ends, that you've got a kind of an agreed upon approach. You probably won't detail every specific thing that has to be done. That would be obviously way too much to put into a contract. But in general terms, you want to state, you know, what time frame the vendor would support you, confirmation and agreement that you would get your data back, that the data would be cleared and destroyed, and that you'd get certification of that, whether there's any fees to transition off of them. Things like that would be considered part of a transition clause. And it's very important to get some kind of language in there so that you take the ambiguity out of what will happen when the contract comes to an end. And generally, they all come to an end at some point in time.
Great. Lisa, we'll come back over to you for this next question. If subservice controls are carved out, how do you obtain a comfort that the subservice controls are effective?
That's a great question. So ultimately, the subservice, when you carve out a subservice, what the vendor is saying is we're not going to represent any of the controls that they're responsible for in this SOC report. So the only real way to validate those controls is to then turn to that subservice and say, okay, we want to evaluate you. And that's usually by doing a SOC report of that subservice or a SOC assessment of that subservice. So again, this is where that relationship building is critical. So, you know, letting your vendors know that your expectation is that you'll be reviewing those critical fourth parties is part of that discussion. So to get that, validation of those controls, you're really going to have to get that directly from the subsurface itself. Now, some people say, okay, well, my vendor does all that vetting, so can I take that? Can't I take the work that my vendor has done? And that's really up to, your due diligence program and how you approach it. We always recommend that you do your own review because you want to make sure that your guidelines are being met, your expectations are being met, not necessarily your vendors.
Thanks, Lisa. I think we can quickly answer one more, and it will go back to you as well. And that question is, should we build supply chain management into our third-party risk management program?
Okay, so yes, the short answer is yes. But this is a tough question because I think we can all acknowledge that we have too much on our plates today as it is, right? So third-party risk management is really hard to get your arms around. But really, I think if you approach supply chain management about identifying risk as it relates to the flow of goods and services that you really need to operate or to provide whatever you provide to your consumers. So from a technology standpoint, this can really be anything from, malware being embedded during production to a disruption caused by a natural disaster that makes your vendor's data center go offline, which means they can't provide to you what you need to operate. So really supply chain management from our perspective at its most basic level is just understanding where everything comes from. So if you have a vendor, you want to understand where does your vendor get what they need. And you need to understand it geographically, right? I mean, that's really what it's all about, is understanding what parts of the world or the country or the flow will be impacted and what that means to you. So the short answer is yes, but I also don't want people to go down a rabbit hole where they feel like they're not doing what they should be doing. It's more of just an extension of what you're doing today and building it into how you approach third-party risk management.
Great. Thanks so much, Lisa. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thank you, Kelly and Lisa, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we did not have time to answer today, we will address with you offline. We'd like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. A big thank you to Kelly and Lisa for their time and great content. You can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank and online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you'll find thousands of free educational resources related to third-party risk management topics such as contracting, cybersecurity, stock reports, and more. If you'd like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register on the site or shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set your password. We did record today's session, and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive Friday afternoon. Also in that email will be the survey link for you to request the CPE credits. We'd like to thank you all for attending and hope you found day 2 of the bootcamp valuable. On behalf of VidMinder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you, and we will see you tomorrow for the 3rd and final day of the bootcamp.